this morning we talked about stewardship, and as we've been doing with these different spiritual disciplines in the evenings, we're going to talk about maybe some of the things that stand in the way of that. And in my mind, at least, it kind of came back to a few major things, but greed and envy being the most noticeable of them. So to remind you from this morning, if you slept since then, or if you weren't here, what we basically said this morning is this. Stewardship is a journey from remembering to contentment to generosity. And so we started in Deuteronomy 8 looking at how God's people have this tendency to forget what he's done and then start to do different things based on that. And then we talked some about Paul and the fact that he wanted us to be content in all circumstances through his words that came through the Spirit. And then we led ourselves to generosity. So when we can change our attitude about stuff and about resources and money, then we can gradually move to the point where it's a little easier to let go of it. And so we're moving kind of on this journey. So as we think of that, I think there are four things that get in the way of good stewardship. And I had options to go with tonight. I ended up picking greed and envy. But first of all, hoarding. Now, I thought about putting saving here, but saving is a positive thing most of the time. But sometimes saving can get out of control. And so we find ourselves moving from preparing for a rainy day kind of stuff to we are just gathering as much as humanly possible, and it kind of takes that turn into hoarding. Secondly, worry. Now, I feel like worry probably relates to all of the other three in one way or another, maybe some more than others, but because we worry about things, so I think in terms of my wife has told me about her grandfather's family living through the Great Depression, and how that kind of changed how you see things, and you wanted to, use everything up instead of letting things be wasted. I found somewhere along the way in becoming the adults within the family and being the ones who pay for things that you start to notice as things get thrown out a little bit more. I have this pet peeve within my house, and it's better than it used to be now that our kids are getting a little older, but there was a time where I found so many half-full water bottles that I cannot even begin to explain to you. And in my mind, I'm calculating how much those cases of water bottles cost, and that half of them were not getting drank anyway, and it just frustrated me. And sometimes our worry drives us to kind of hang on to things more tightly. Now, third, greed. So there is just so much to have out there, and we want it all, and we want to have as much as we can. And this could be driven also by the other two, and we'll see that relate here in a minute. And then fourth, envy. There are people who have things that we want, people who are at a place that we would like to be, and we just want to have what others have. And that has driven people to do pretty dumb things throughout the course of history, and we see a lot of it in Scripture. So tonight, we're going to spend most of our time looking at the last two of these, although, as I said, I think you'll see the others relate in here in one way or another. Paul, when he's listing off all of those sins in Romans chapter 1, they're in the midst of it. He has this to say. Just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy. And I switched to New American Standard tonight, by the way, because it has covetousness in the ESV instead of greed, which is the same thing, but greed's a little easier to see. Greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips. There are all these awful things they're doing, and they're in the midst of it all. We find greed and envy. And so we tend to, even though we say a sin is a sin is a sin, and all sins are kind of the same, we tend to, I think, subconsciously categorize them and rank them in some way or another. And so you think of things like murder, strife, and deceit as at a higher level than greed and envy, because we see probably too much greed and envy around us and are maybe guilty of it at times. But here is greed and envy right in the midst of all of this. So greed and envy, I learned from Romans chapter 1, are serious problems. When you put two things in the middle of that list of things that are very serious, clearly they're part of the issue. So greed and envy are worth us looking about tonight. So we're going to do it in a little different way. We're not looking at Webster definitions tonight. We're not going to look at just lots of little scriptures from all over the place. There are two parables that speak to this specifically within the New Testament, and I think they will help us to see what greed and envy may do if we're not careful with the way we have our attitudes about those things. First of all, a parable about envy in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. And we'll read through the whole parable and then just make a few comments on it along the way. Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 1. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard." So he finds all these workers out, agrees on a price of what the cost is going to be for the day, and then he sends them out to work. In verse 3, it says, "And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and to them he said, 'You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give to you.' So they went, going out again about the 6th hour, and the 9th hour he did the same." Now, it's interesting to me, this is not how we do contracts nowadays, is it? Whatever is right, I will give to you. Could you imagine that in your job interview? What does this pay? Well, whatever is right, I will give to you. But this is what the master says, and they all kind of agree on that and continue on with the day. About the 11th hour, so way after this first group of people, and even quite a bit after the middle groups of people, about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." Now, it's hard for us, if this is a familiar parable to you, to read this for the first time, to read it as if you don't know where this is all leading. How would you think in our American culture today, in the way we think of wages and work and all of that stuff, how would this work out exactly? You know, if we were doing a big project here at the church and we were doing lots of landscaping and things, we had brought people in and they had been working all day long, and they watched as somebody was walking down the street, and we happened to run into that person and say, "Do you need some work too?" And we brought them in to do the last hour or so. And then we started divvying up, what would you think would happen? I mean, wouldn't you think those that were there all day would get the most, and then those who were there in the middle would get, somewhere in between, and then whoever just showed up there at the very end would get just a little bit? That's kind of the way all these things should work. But that's not how it works. It says in verse 8 that when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. And if we remember back to the beginning of the story, this is the agreed upon day's wage for that group that's been there all day long. And yet these folks who are there at the end get that amount. Now, if you are the people who have been there all day long and you watch this, you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, this is great. He's going to give us more than we anticipated. There's going to be something more." And yet it says when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day in the scorching heat." So basically, if we're going to look at this in modern terms, it's not fair. It's not fair. They're not getting their fair share compared to our fair share. We should get more than them. And there are one of two ways to look at that. There are those who would say, they got that much, which means we should get that much more. Or those who might say, you need to take away from them because what you're giving us is the fair thing that was said. They're working so much less, they need to have less. And I like to think this is something from a 2,000-year-old parable, but these are conversations you will hear down at the Aldridge over coffee, are they not? I mean, this is the way we think nowadays, that what I have and what you have needs to be amicable in some way. And who gets to decide that? Well, me. I get to decide that. And so you're very interested in what coworkers make, neighbors make. You're very interested in what people get paid for a certain thing, for a certain time. And then you begin to assume all of these things should relate to what I do. And it's very much human nature, but also very much it plays against us. So these folks are dealing with envy in the midst of this. But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity so that the last will be first and the first last?" Now, before you get ahead of me in your mind, especially if you're familiar with the parable, I know this is about the kingdom. I know this is about the Jews and the Gentiles and all. I get that. But there is also very much a truth here about envy. And it's a truth that drives us into envy when it comes to our stewardship and our generosity or our lack thereof and how we view money and things like that. which is we tend to think way too much about what someone else has or doesn't have. And we tend to think way too much about what we have, and then we begin to compare the two. And there are some of those things that maybe are helpful to understanding the world, but when we start to harp on that too much, and that becomes too much of our focus, what that drives us towards is bitterness. And we get in a place that we don't want to be and begin to want things maybe that we don't need or not for the right reasons. So as we think of this parable, I like the question that's asked. I'd ask it in this way: are you envious while God is generous? Because what we don't do so often is think of these things in terms of our relationship with God. Because if you are the God of the universe who has provided all of the things that we have and the blessings that come our way and has given us this world in which to live and to work and make the living that we make, is not all of that His generosity? And when we are envious of what someone else has, we're not just we're not just feeling that I'm missing out on something. We're saying in the midst of that we don't believe God has given us enough. We don't believe that God can be trusted with these decisions, much like the guy who is the master of all these people who are working within the parable. We don't think that that guy has the criteria or the knowledge to decide who gets paid what. We should decide. And I don't believe we would ever say that to God. We've talked about prayer not very long ago. I doubt in your prayers to God, you say to God, well, God, clearly you don't understand what I should have and what someone else should have. You'd never say it in those words. And yet the actions and the feelings we have so often, this is the message we convey, not only to Him, but to those around us. I forgot the line in the song a minute ago, but there's a great line about basically our trusting in God and how that is something that shows to the world around us. We show who God is through how we interact with things like generosity and envy. So are we envious when God is generous? Now the second parable is in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. It is not entitled in your Bible a parable about greed, but it is a parable that we're probably pretty familiar with. It says that someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Can you imagine? You know, I've joked about before that I have a list running of things I want to ask when I get to heaven, that I'm assuming as soon as I walk through, if there are gates, as soon as I walk through the gates, I will totally forget the list because it's so great I won't care anymore. But I have all these things I wonder about. I wonder if you could talk with Jesus and just if He were here and sitting next to you, if you could ask Him anything, think of all the things you may think of. And here are these people who approach Jesus, and their question for Him is, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. I want you to settle this dispute among us. So clearly there's already a wrong focus when they come to Jesus. But He said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Which He will do at other times, but not necessarily in this case. And He said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness or greed. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." You will not see that in a Super Bowl ad this coming February. One's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And He told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods.'" Which brings the question to us, how much is enough? You know, do you find yourself, I mentioned to you before the idea of downsizing this morning. It's amazing the number of things that at one time were very important that later down the road have either lost value or worn out. And they're just not really all that useful anymore. And they were so important and so much something you needed to have, and yet things begin to change and you realize all these things are temporary. So he's trying to decide, I've got all of this. The crops have been so great. What do I do? Maybe I should tear down the barns and build larger ones. "And I will say to my soul," verse 19, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." And this is the danger, too, of if we have so much and so much and so much, don't we begin to get kind of lazy and rest on that? And so this guy has all of these amazing crops. He decides to build bigger barns, and now he can just kick back and relax, and everything will be good. In verse 20, it says that God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. If you had one of those moments in life, or maybe more than one of those moments in life, where everything that seemed important the moment before was suddenly a whole lot less important now, situations change, there's loss, there's struggle, and everything that seemed so much to be important, so much worth working for, suddenly none of that stuff mattered anymore. And God says to him, your life is going to be taken. All of this stuff that you're storing up, it's not going to do you any good. You're not going to be able to kick back and relax because you won't be here to do it. And the question for us is, are you building bigger barns, or are you being rich toward God? And isn't this kind of that journey we looked at this morning in stewardship, the journey from kind of hanging on to everything to being generous with things? Which one of those places do we find ourselves? And for most of us, we probably have found ourselves at different places along the way. I hope that our desire is to get to a point where it is rich towards God most of the time. So what are the next words of Jesus after this parable? I love parables, and I love to look at them on their own sometimes, but sometimes when we pull them out of context, we do a little bit of disservice. I love his next words right after he has said this. In verse 22, he said to the disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious." So why do we build bigger barns? Why are we greedy about things? Why are we envious of others and want the things that they have? Doesn't it all come back to this? Doesn't it all come back to we think that we are anxious about stuff, and so I will gather, and I will gather, and I will hoard, and I will hoard, and then it will all be okay. And what we learn within this parable is it actually has the opposite effect. Here is this man in the parable who has so much, he had to build bigger barns. He had to find another place to put all of his stuff, and then he still has anxiety because the very next word is, do not be anxious. Does being ruled by greed and envy just create more anxiety? And if we understood that, would it change what we do? Would it change how we see resources and things from something I've got to grab onto as much as I can of to something I want to be able to give freely because I've been blessed with it too? I believe that most of us have probably found that as you gather and probably have more than you ever imagined having, that it has not taken away the anxiety that comes with that. So Jesus continues, "Do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to a span of life?" How much have those times of incredible anxiety helped you? How much have you found yourself just overwhelmed by it, and it's the getting out of the anxiety that is the helpful thing, not so much the getting into it? As we found greed and envy in the midst of that list of all the sins, one way I saw envy described this week, and I can't remember who said it, was envy is the only sin that doesn't involve any pleasure. When you're envious of someone, even if you gather whatever it is that they have, or they come down to a lower spot, it just really doesn't do anything for you. You don't find yourself in a better place. So and which of you will be anxious? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to a span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Now, Jesus will occasionally ask a question that is a very good question that at the beginning, when I first see it, I think to myself, I'm not sure if this is a helpful question, Jesus. Why are you anxious? Start listing off all the things, don't you start to become a little more anxious? And yet he says, since you know the anxiety doesn't do anything, since you know by being anxious you're not even going to add an hour to your life, then why? Why are you anxious about everything from a God who takes care of even the birds who are out there? Consider the lilies, verse 27, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Do you think anyone in Solomon's day looked at lilies in the field and Solomon and all his wealth and thought Solomon was not the better thing there? Even the most nature-loving among folks, wouldn't they look at everything that Solomon had and all of the wisdom and think that's the thing to strive toward and almost miss the lilies in the field who they grow because of what God does, not because of what we do? But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? So another thing beyond just what it says about us and our trust in God is when we worry like this, when we're anxious like this, it's a statement of where our faith is. We want to be people who are faithful, and yet so many times we operate as if we have to be the ones directing things, as if we have to be the ones making sure of what happens and not of what God is doing. And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Maybe this is something that we need to remember tonight. Those needs that you believe that you have, God knows what you need. God is the one, as we talked about in the midst of fasting, God is the one who provides. So he knows what you need even before you have asked. Verse 31, instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Instead, seek his kingdom. So of all the things that we tend to get greedy about or envious about or want to hoard, the things we want to gather and we feel like are so important, instead of all of those things, seek his kingdom. Verse 32, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. What you seek is what your heart is going to find. So are we people who are seeking the kingdom, or are we instead seeking the things of this world, the things that everyone else in our world is seeking that really don't make us all that much different than they are? Are we instead seeking God? So tonight, this again is kind of one of those, it's probably not a come up here and confess something kind of thing, but you know where your heart is. And you know if your treasure and your heart, they are together, which direction are they going? Are you constantly thinking of the next thing here? Are you constantly worried about the things of this world? Or are you seeking the kingdom? If you have never followed him before, the beginning of that seeking is being baptized into him to begin to follow and seek out this new kind of life. And you can know that your treasure will be in heaven instead of here on earth. Or if you have found yourself just kind of caught up in the things of the world, I think most of us are. This is one of the hardest things in the world to preach on, by the way, because I know we all struggle at one time or another with some of these things at different levels. And we all probably have a tendency to look at other groups and them having a struggle with this that is worse than ours somehow because of the thing that they want. We all struggle with this at one level or another. If you struggle with that, know that you don't have to. You can look to what God does in nature. You can look to what God has done in your own life and know that he cares for you and he loves you and he is the one who provides. Get rid of that anxiety. Get rid of the worry about things that God doesn't want you to worry about and instead seek his kingdom tonight. If there's some way we can help you, please come while we stand and sing.